During the race to the moon that began during the late 1950s, the Soviet Union was ahead of the United States in almost every single category of space exploration. It seemed inevitable that they would land a man on the lunar surface first. But as we know, that didn't happen. So what were the Soviets first in space, and how is it that the United States, who always seemed to be the runner-up, beat them to the moon? What went wrong with a seemingly unstoppable space program? Let's find out. When the United States landed Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon in July of 1969, realizing the goal set by President Kennedy, America could claim that they had won the space race. They had achieved the ultimate goal. They had obtained the brass ring. But up until then, the Soviet Union was winning the space race by nearly every single metric. They were proving, by at least their standards, that the communist system was superior to the Western capitalistic way of life. On October 4th, 1957, the USSR successfully launched the first satellite into space. Sputnik was sent into Earth's orbit aboard an R-7 rocket and marked the beginning of the space age. But it was more than just a symbolic achievement. The launch of Sputnik had a major impact on the Cold War. A Soviet satellite was now in orbit above the United States. It shocked experts and citizens, leading to fears that the US had fallen behind in developing new technology. It also led to concerns in the United States about Soviet technological superiority, prompting US policymakers to accelerate space and weapons programs. Sputnik's launch initiated the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union, which ultimately led to the creation of NASA. Before the United States could respond with their own satellite, the Soviets pulled off yet another first. Less than a month after Sputnik, Laika, a dog who was part husky and part terrier, was launched into space aboard Sputnik 2. She was a stray dog found wandering the streets of Moscow when she was recruited for the mission that sent the first living creature into space. Unfortunately, technology to bring her back home had not yet been developed. She would die as a result of overheating on the spacecraft's fourth orbit. Launched on November 3rd, 1957, the significance of Sputnik 2 was more than just putting a living being in space. The mission used the first platform capable of making scientific measurements in orbit. It returned scientific data from above the Earth's atmosphere for an extended period of time, providing valuable information about space and the Earth's environment. With a mass of 508 kilograms, Sputnik 2 represented a dramatic leap in orbital mass over its predecessor, Sputnik 1. This demonstrated the Soviet Union's technological prowess in space exploration. On January 2nd, 1959, Lunar 1 was launched. While not intended to leave Earth orbit, it did because it was carrying too much speed. This spacecraft would become the first man-made object to leave Earth's orbit and enter into the sun's orbit. Lunar 2 launched in September of the same year and was intended to leave the Earth's orbit. Its final destination was the moon. It reached the surface, making it the first man-made object to make contact with another celestial body. Lunar 2 carried various scientific instruments to conduct tests during its journey to the moon. These instruments provided valuable data about the moon and the environment in space. Less than a month after Lunar 2, Lunar 3 launched and began to orbit the moon. It became the first three-axis stabilized spacecraft, meaning that it held fixed in the desired orientation without any rotation. It was also the first to accomplish the goal of photographing the far side of the moon, the first to automatically develop the film while aboard the ship and convert them to radio signals, and the first to use gravity assist to slingshot the spacecraft back to Earth to retrieve the photos. The Soviets closed out the decade of the 1950s clearly ahead in the space race, and as the 1960s began, they showed no signs of slowing down. In August of 1960, the first animals successfully returned from orbit. Belka and Strelka were launched aboard Sputnik 5 and became the first living creatures to be recovered from orbit. And in February of 1961, the Soviets became the first to launch a spacecraft to perform an interplanetary flight. Venera 1 was designed to fly by Venus without entering the orbit. Although it ceased communicating on the way there, it marked a crucial step in space exploration by attempting to reach another planet. The Venera program, which included subsequent missions, provided valuable data about Venus's surface, its atmosphere, and environment, contributing to our understanding of this neighboring planet. The Venera mission set several firsts, including the first probe to descend into the atmosphere of a planet other than Earth, and the first spacecraft to make a soft landing on another planet. On April 12, 1961, the Soviets, like the launch of Sputnik, would shock the world. Aboard Vostok 1, Yuri Gagarin, the son of peasants who endured German occupation during World War II, became the first human being to fly in space. Not only the first in space, but the first to orbit the Earth. This was the most significant achievement in human space exploration up to this point, and further cemented the Soviet Union's dominance of space. In August of the same year, Vostok 2 launched and became the first crewed mission to last a full day in space. 6 days later, Vostok 3 and 4 launched, becoming the first spacecrafts to communicate via radio. It was also the first time 2 manned spacecrafts were in space together. And in yet another significant first, the Soviets launched Vostok 6 on June 16, 1963. It carried Valentina Tereshkova, making her the first woman to travel to space and the first civilian. This marked an historic milestone in space exploration, demonstrating the capability of women to participate in human spaceflight. Aside from making Valentina the first woman in space, the mission investigated the effects of zero gravity on the female body, providing valuable data on how space flights affect women. Now, prior to this mission, it was thought that only men, and specifically male fighter pilots, could handle the physical demands of spaceflight. With data collected on previous flights and the data collected on this one, that myth was dispelled. Now, on March 23, 1965, the Soviets yet again etched their name in the record books when cosmonaut Alexei Leonov became the first person to conduct a spacewalk. His journey outside the Voskhod 2 lasted 10 minutes. To continue their track record of first in space, the Soviets landed Lunar 9 on the surface of the moon on February 3, 1966. This wasn't their first landing on the moon, but it was the first soft landing. It also became the first spacecraft to take photographs of the lunar surface from the lunar surface. In October of 1967, the Soviets successfully docked 2 remote-controlled spacecraft in Earth's orbit. This was the first time that this had ever been done. During Zond 5 in September of '68, the Soviets became the first to travel and circle the moon in a circumlunar trajectory. It demonstrated the Soviet Union's capability to send a spacecraft on a trajectory around the moon and return it safely to Earth. This mission provided valuable data and insights for future lunar and interplanetary missions and put the Soviets as the odds-on favorite to land a human on the moon first. Another significant milestone that must be achieved prior to going to the moon is the ability to dock 2 spacecraft in orbit. The Soviets had already accomplished this with unmanned remote-controlled crafts. But on January 16, 1969, they became the first to do it with 2 manned spacecraft. Now, they never admitted this publicly, but when President Kennedy challenged NASA to land a man on the moon successfully before the end of the decade, the Soviets took that to heart. They saw it as a direct challenge, and it was a challenge that they intended to win. The Soviets had mastered almost all the skills necessary to land a man on the moon, but sending a probe to the lunar surface was one thing, but sending men and a heavy lunar lander was a whole nother thing. And that's where the Soviets' trouble began. To get everything needed to land on the moon, to the moon, you need a really big rocket, bigger than anything that had ever existed prior to the mid-1960s. The United States had the Saturn V, while the Soviets chose the N-1. The Saturn V used 5 large engines. However, the Soviets decided on a different approach. Theirs would use 30 smaller engines. This meant that the plumbing needed to fuel those engines in sync was very complicated. Testing of the N-1 began in 1969, The first 2 tests failed, with the rocket exploding shortly after liftoff. The advantage had now shifted to the United States and NASA. The Saturn V had already been tested and was ready. On July 20th, 1969, Armstrong and Aldrin walked on the lunar surface and claimed the biggest prize of the space race, the moon. The Soviets would test the N-1 2 more times in the early 1970s with the same results. The project was a failure. After the 4th failure, the N-1 program was canceled. The Soviets would continue their exploration of space, but the moon had already been lost. Their focus would turn towards building a space station and putting it in orbit. It was a goal that they would achieve, becoming, you guessed it, the first to do so. The world will remember the United States' triumph on that summer day in 1969, but tends to forget that the Soviet space program had been dominant up until then. It's been 50 years since a human being has walked on the moon, but that is all about to change. Click the screen now to learn how the United States is planning to go back to the moon, and from there, Mars. And if you like this video, I would very much appreciate it if you would like and subscribe, as it goes a long way towards helping out the channel. Until next time, I'm Dennis Gill for Revealing History.